Welcome to Unlearn, where we talk to industry leaders about unlearning how we go to market.
I'm Kelly Sarabin, and I run Tech Partner Enablement and Advocacy at HubSpot.
And I'm Asher Matthew, co-founder of Partnership Leaders.
The old ways of going to market are getting more expensive and less effective.
To thrive in an era of digital transformation, you have to go to market differently. Let's find out how. Hey everybody, welcome back to Unlearn. We just finished discussing modern men's fashion, so hopefully we can get into much better topics here. Today we have Rand Fishkin. He's a celebrity, but Rand, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, sounds good, Asher. Let's see. So I am most well known for running a couple of companies in the marketing software world. I started a company called Moz many years ago, left that company in 2018, wrote a book called Lost and Founder, Painfully Honest Field Guide to the Startup World, which I think my favorite quote about it was, "You'll never raise money in Silicon Valley again." And so I recommend it.
And not raising money right now is cool. So,
wait, wasn't that already proven false though? Didn't you subsequently raise money or no?
Not in Silicon Valley.
Okay, got it.
Okay, fair enough.
Wait, you raise better money, basically. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Higher quality money.
Thank you. Thank you. Better money from better sources. Yes. So I raised money in June of 2018 for a company called SparkToro, which is a company that I run these days. SparkToro does audience research software. Moz, my old company, did SEO.
Yep.
And SparkToro, yes, is funded in a very unique alternative way. We raised $1.3 million from 35 angel investors, like individual people who put in between like 25 and 100K each. And in a few days, actually, we are going to pay them their money back.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very unique funding model where essentially it's a kind of a short-term low interest loan or no interest loan. And then they also own their shares in the company going forward.
Wow.
And we plan to hopefully pay out profit dividends every few years. And so our goal is help them get 2, 3, 5, 10 times their money back, but over a long period of time and with a model that is a much safer, less high risk sort of way to build a business. And we think startup survival rates can be
much better,
60%, 70%, 80% instead of the 3% that they are in venture.
Yeah,
so this is our belief. I also, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, did you guys formulate that model yourself, or were you tapping into someone else's? Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So we, Kelly, we actually published our funding docs online, open sourced.
Right.
Paid our lawyers a little bit extra. So anyone can, Google SparkToro funding and you can use our docs, fill in the blanks for your own company or project. I'm excited to say I'm actually planning to use them again.
Okay.
A few other startups have funded their companies with it. And the folks at, Rob Walling and Einar Volset with their fund, Tiny Seed Investments, actually use the SparkToro model as well for all of their investments. And so my wife and I are, oddly enough, making a video game. We're working with a publisher down in Los Angeles, and in the fundraise for that video game development process, using exactly the same funding model. So my hope is in a few years, I'll be able to tell a story in a sequel to Lost and Founder about like, hey, maybe there's a better way to start up.
And is the intention that you would raise again now that you've paid back the initial investors, or is it a one-time thing and then you're essentially bootstrapped as the model?
Yeah, that's absolutely the goal. There's nothing to prevent us from being able to go out and raise. Like we would have to get approval from our shareholders, that kind of thing. But we could conceivably raise money. So it doesn't preclude you from later going the venture route if you want to, or later doing something else. But my feeling is that this is an underutilized, underthought about method for raising money in a much lower risk kind of way.
Yeah.
Right? Because the business's goal, instead of growth at all costs, is how do we get to profitability quickly? And how do we stay there for a long period of time?
Yeah.
And this incentivizes behavior that's sort of the opposite of venture world, which is how do I become a category crushing leader and, $1 billion company, or die trying.
Yep.
And of course, the stats say the die trying is just,
Almost everyone.
9.5.
Yeah.
It's growth at managed costs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, the model is interesting in that, so my and my co-founders' salaries are capped until we complete investor repayment, and then they're capped at a different level.
Yeah.
And so the only way that we can really, make money apart from, a salary, which is fine, but it's capped to the Seattle software engineer average, whatever that number is. And once we pay back our investors, then we can increase that, but only to again, another maximum. And then the way that we potentially make money off this business is we pay out dividends, and we pay those dividends to everyone. So, if you own 2% of SparkToro and I own 20%, if I want to make my 20%, I got to pay you your 2%,
Yeah.
in addition to paying you back for the initial investment.
It's almost like you went public first and then built the company. Because this is what Berkshire Hathaway does, right? Like literally they're like, hey, we own these assets, we own them for a very long time, and then we're just a value investor, and you just get dividends, and you build your thing on dividends and T-bonds and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think about it like, I don't know if the two of you own any stock in the public market. I didn't until recently. We now have like a financial advisor person who helps us invest and is like, okay, we're going to put some money here or there. I don't know exactly where it is, but I assume it's in responsible places.
Well, the financial advisor knows. So hopefully it's not a Bernard
I trust them.
Let's get that kind of pod for a sec.
Yeah. So they put money into, right, the stock market, bonds, treasuries, whatever, right? Like all these financial instruments, securities. And some of them are growth stocks, right? Like Google doesn't pay a dividend. The idea is you hopefully buy Google at one price and then it increases in price to another number.
Yep.
But then there's also dividend stocks,
Yep.
right? Like 3M, right? 3M pays a dividend sort of every quarter, and they're very reliable about this. And, lots of people know that it's 3M isn't going to be worth 10 times what it was worth last year. Probably, maybe it will be, but probably not. But it is going to pay out my, 3 cents for every share that I own.
Yep.
And I think it's really weird that small companies and startups don't have an option like this. And investors who want to invest in the private markets don't have hey, can I balance my portfolio by putting some things into really high risk, insane, crazy, well, this is probably going to die, but maybe one chance in 100 that it, becomes, a big venture success. I think investors are also interested in, hey, I would like to fund some SparkToro type companies. Like, give me some of that lower risk, high odds that I'm going to get paid back in a few years.
Yep.
And I can put that money to work in other places. And then I own shares in these companies that pay dividends for long periods of time. That, I think it feels really healthy. It is.
It's you can actually live life, I would say, if one, enjoy it. And while we're on the topic of this, so venture is just 10% or less of all investment dollars out there. And actually today, as of today, like if you go by Morningstar, the top 10 dividend stocks are Verizon Communications, Pfizer, Cisco, Comcast, Medtronic, Gilead, Duke Energy, and Blackstone, which is basically a company that acquires other companies. And so like there's nothing wrong with that investment model. And one would say the real like old school money is actually sitting in that bucket versus this bucket that we call alternative investments, which is where most VC gets funded. And if there were higher quality and let's call it industry benchmarked executives and / operators that were running these startups and running them professionally, you would actually attract all that money. And there's no limit to that cash, by the way, because there's tons of it sitting out there.
Well, so that's a good question, though. Is there yet, and it sounds like this is kind of nascent stages, but is there some kind of a platform where we could have these type of investors interested to connect with startups? Because one common problem, and you see this with women or people who aren't white trying to raise VC money, it's a struggle, right? So this is another or because they wrote a book that offended people potentially. But either way,
Exactly.
part of the problem is like, how do you?
If your blog said death of something, you're not raising money after that.
But how do you connect, right? Because if you take some of these people, they just don't have the deep networks that would kind of be able to make those connections happen and funnel people who even want to be in this model, right? Because the way you're describing it actually sounds beneficial for the investor and for the startup, sort of the fate of the startup, so to speak. But I guess that's something that we need to wait to see invented. And perhaps if you're circulating it and more people start using it, someone will jump onto it and create that platform where you can connect the investors and the companies.
Yeah, I mean, my hope, Kelly, is absolutely what you're talking about, right? Essentially, like when I went, when I left Moz, which was under not ideal circumstances in any way, and I did not have the finances personally to be able to bootstrap a company, right? Like Geraldine and I had a mortgage. We had to make payments on that mortgage,
Yep.
and we needed healthcare, right? Like
Everybody else.
very
What's
quickly,
this?
right? And
This basic human
yeah, and it's
necessity.
and it's insanely expensive, right? Like healthcare is a huge portion of what SparkToro spends every month is just on healthcare for myself and my co-founder Casey, and to do that, like we needed help. We needed to be able to get off the ground, and we did not want to fund it with venture dollars, obviously, and maybe the book precluded me from doing that anyway. But the reality was, without the network that I had built over the course of my kind of career at Moz, no, there would have been no way.
Yeah.
No one had even heard of this thing, right? Like all the investors that I pitched, I had to one by one sell them on the concept. But now that it's here, I don't know whether it's going to take 10 years or 20 years, or it won't happen until after my lifetime. Like, but that's okay. It has to start somewhere, right? Like I believe this thing should exist. I know it's a little bit, it's not a not-for-profit. It's not sort of a super obvious path to like this incredible ethical good. But I think it is an incredible ethical good thing to have companies that aren't focused on companies and a class of investment that is not focused on how do we do maximum sort of wealth creation for an extremely small number of people in companies, and then have a huge number that fail and make nothing and sort of have a terrible experience.
Yeah.
I think changing that and building a stronger small business, medium business economy is actually truly a really good ethical thing.
So
I think
so
that change can be something I want to see. So you're right. If you don't have a network like mine, if you are like I'm trying to help a founder right now who is attempting to raise money, not quite this way, but in a similar style. He's a guy who grew up in Angola during the civil war there, and then moved to the UK. Has this incredible company. Like his tech is mind-bogglingly cool. It's called Team Sports, and the product is cool. He's got a lot of traction, but he has no network. He knows like me and 6 other people that I know, right? And
he didn't go to Stanford and
talent.
And that's the truth. So a lot of
Is,
people come from affluent backgrounds, and their family and friends around is just a bunch of wealthy people that they know from growing up in that environment, writing checks, right? And that's, from a society perspective, it's not really the best allocation of resources.
Well, so okay,
And
if I may just like share like why this system is set up this way, right? So the theory is that a small group of really smart people get a bunch of cash to go run millions of experiments. And through that, innovation takes place. Now, how that became the norm is like something to decipher. We can maybe unpack that right in this episode or in our other episodes, but like somehow that became the norm. Somehow it became like that is the cool way to do this, right? But essentially, like even if you go speak with an investment professional, the investment professional will always say, look, hey, let's take 10% of, let's call it quote unquote play money, right? And then put it in pockets where you could generate an amazing return. And so then if you think about what the valley offers, right, specifically, right, is the networks, the resources, the access to technology, and actually access to a bunch of number of things, right? Access to experience, right? And the whole idea is that we take these bursts of experiments, and then we go and find if we can accelerate innovation so that we can compete with the rest of the countries around the world. That's point number one. Point number two is these things were supposed to be controlled experiments, not this, like, because what happens right now is like, okay, big tech company moves too slow, so I'll go take an internal problem that they aren't able to fix, create a feature out of it, then build a company on it, raise on a massive valuation, and try to grow into the valuation, right? That's kind of like the opposite, because like big tech companies have actually figured out, they're like, well, we're not going to get disrupted anymore. We'll just wait till this is a $10 million ARR company and we are either acquiring them or we are going and building this ourselves. And so now the startup is essentially trying to outrun the existing resources who are all working on a different priority. So just a couple of points that, at least as I've tried to unpack and really rationalize this conversation, this theory of growth at all costs and stuff. That's kind of at least where it came from. But what do you all think?
That's super interesting. I mean, I think what isn't discussed enough is this model good for society? Like, leave aside the fact of those 97% of founders who their company goes under. Is this setting up rational incentives when you look at society as large? And was this maybe originally supposed to play a smaller role versus now how much of new SaaS companies is it founding? A lot. And you mentioned a 10% number off of something else, I'm sure. But if you look at like new SaaS companies, I'm sure the ones that are VC backed, pretty high percentage, right? So, and then you look at certain things like Uber and WeWork, and you ask yourself, is this money funding bad business models and sort of like allowing them to exist when they wouldn't otherwise exist? And then original investors piece out, Adam Newman pieces out with a bunch of cash, and it just like kind of flounders
That's a
around.
hookup.
So
That's not an investment.
but, speaking of going public, I know his public documents were apparently quite entertaining, but never went through. But no, I think that is a question that isn't discussed. I think people just take it for granted that this is the model exists, and we hear a little bit more about how tough it is for founders, but I think it would behoove us as an industry to look at it more critically and say, is this, from a society perspective, basically flushing hundreds of millions and billions of dollars into bad business models where people are just shoving money to the appearance of growth on what is never going to be a profitable business model, right? Because like Uber rides were subsidized. People got those rides because they were cheaper, but they were cheaper because of the VC money, not necessarily because it's a sustainable business model. That is not a good thing for society to just, cover that up and then have early investors bail. And then the public continues to bet on it, particularly like through the stock market is always an option. But that's not necessarily good either. So yeah, I'd be curious if, Rand, if you've given some thought to that, because it sounds like you have thought about this issue a lot.
Yeah. So for Lost and Founder, I did a little bit of research and interviewing some folks, right, about like the history of venture capital, how to become an asset class, and why does it sort of exist? Why is it such a powerful sort of force in the early stage business world, especially technology? And so venture capital was created by lobbying that happened in the late 60s and early 70s for a new tax bracket, a new system of taxation. And essentially the system of taxation is what we call capital gains. Yep. So, essentially you have a bunch of wealthy people lobbying both at the time, right? 60s and 70s, both Republican and Democratic lawmakers. And they sort of pass this thing that capital gains will be taxed at this much lower rate, right? 10, 15, 18, 20% versus ordinary income, which at the time, right, was 50% plus. Now it's down. I think ordinary income, the maximum tax rate is sitting around 40, 41% or whatever. But
But 40
historically
is
it
a
was
lot
much
more
higher.
than 15, right? And when you're rich,
Yeah.
you're pushed. Most of your money is in the highest bracket.
Yes, right. So basically, these wealthy folks say, "Hey, lawmakers, I am going to try and tell you this story about trickle down economics." Right. The idea is that if you get me to invest in more businesses, then that wealth will trickle down to the rest of the economy, and everyone will be made wealthier. And the wealth of this top tax bracket will be, yes, we'll make more money and we won't have to pay as much in taxes, but it will help everybody. And this argument was some combination of either compelling or we won't fund your campaigns unless you do this for us, right? And so through
Or meeting up at Burning Man. Yep.
there was no Burning Man at the time, I don't think, but maybe there was. But yeah, so they essentially, right, convinced these lawmakers to implement the capital gains tax rate, which created the venture capital industry. And the idea behind venture is, if you look at the mathematics of it, there's a number of people who've written good articles about this and sort of published them. But the mathematics basically say that to win in venture, win meaning beat the S&P 500's average rate of return year over year, you need to invest in about 500 companies, statistically speaking, right? Given the failure rates, success rates,
Yep.
and you need a tax rate that is half or less what ordinary income is. So if either of those scenarios are not true, if you can't invest in enough companies, or if you're getting taxed at the normal rates, the asset class doesn't beat the market.
Can we flag for a second? Because I think this is just interesting in general. So that 500 number, right, presumes that they're not that great at discerning which companies are going to go, right? Like, because it sounds barely better than chance, to be frank. And you hear that a lot.
I'm presenting the average statistics, right? So every venture capitalist, obviously, when they go and pitch their LPs, their limited partners, the people who put money into a venture asset, when they go pitch them, they're going to say to them, "Hey, we can pick way better than the average." Right? So the pitch is obviously, here's why we're so much better at picking than the average. Obviously, statistically speaking, that's not true, right? But are there venture capital providers who are better than the average? Yes. And are there many who are worse than the average? Absolutely. And that's why it's an average. So I'm giving you this 500 number as I think most famously the company 500 Startups, right, was the one that sort of famously turned this into their name. Granted, then Dave turned out to be a sexual harassing creep, and so that company was shut down.
I'm laughing at that story.
I mean, he was
lost in VC, I guess.
Yeah, this is not unusual. I mean, Kelly, but this speaks to your point around like who gets to raise money, who is allowed in the door, who is allowed access to these folks, and it is almost exclusively white and Asian men who live in coastal America, who are between the ages of 25 and 55, who are cis and straight, and like you look at the categories
backgrounds.
That's right. So almost 2/3 of all venture invested CEOs come from a background of significant family wealth. So their parents would be accredited investors by the definition of the United States government, more than $1 million in assets liquid outside of their primary residence. Yep. So you are talking about essentially wealthy white and Asian men from coastal America getting the overwhelming majority of this capital and running almost all these companies, and then becoming almost all of the venture capitalists. The venture capital industry is a little under 20% women partners in venture capital firms and less than 2% funding to women founders. Yeah. So it's a weird little world.
This ties into not being good at your job, right? Because there's no way that the best opportunities fit that profile. So it's not a rational process for making the decision. So that 500 number makes a little more sense when you see that they're using these frameworks to make their choices. Like,
so check out the stats. So based on detailed research from Cambridge Associates, the top quartile of VC funds have an average annual return ranging from 15% to 27% over the past 10 years, compared to an average of 9.9% in the S&P 500 return per each of those 10 years. So like if you don't know investing, you just put in the S&P and you'll still be okay effectively.
Very, very okay. This is why, right? The venture asset class had to sort of make this pitch. And my understanding is it's really the top 5% of venture where
Yeah.
almost all the significant returns accumulate, which is not dissimilar from how the venture ecosystem itself works, right? The top 5%, not even 5%, the top 0.5% of companies are where almost all the venture returns come from. So look, I mean, we could go into the macroeconomics of this and all that kind of stuff, but I think that the broad pitch that I'm trying to make, that I'm trying to like, I'm one little person out in Seattle with my two tiny little companies, right? Like SparkToro is a 3-person company doing, $1.5 million of revenue a year and growing, but it's tiny. Like it's so little. And this video game studio is tiny and it, has more people, but these are small efforts. And I think the only thing that I really have to offer here is I hope that I can use my voice to champion this idea to other people, to seed in investors, in people with money, in people who want to start companies, in people who might not look like me and fit the ideal venture profile, to be like, gosh, I wonder if I could raise $50,000 for my tiny little company that I want to get off the ground in increments of $2,000 or $5,000 from 10 friends. And then I could use the SparkToro model to pay those people back. And then we pay dividends for a long period of time. And the answer is absolutely you could, right? If you look at the small business survival success rates in the United States, they're not bad.
They're not bad.
Like
Yeah.
45% of small businesses that, when after 7 years after founding are still around and producing revenue and profits for their founders.
Yeah.
That number is like 10% if you're venture backed. So the minute you take venture, you crush your odds of surviving for 5 or 6 years. Yeah. It's
also just
it's
to double click on what you're saying, Rand, is I think at a certain point in your life, you have to decide what's the outcome that you're going for. And the outcome cannot be $1 billion every single time. It's the equivalent of T2, D3 in your life. And people do cocaine and they die, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so like literally, like that's what happens, right? It's so, and I'm serious about this because I've actually lived both. I've had bootstrapped exits and I've been through a public company experience as well. And I honestly, I would say the bootstrap exit was much better quality. Obviously, the public experience was much better quantity, but we got lucky. We got extremely lucky. We tried to go public 3 times. At one point in time, we had $300 million, and we were still thinking that we may run the company to the ground. Like, I mean, these are just very different pressures to deal with. And the point I'm trying to make is that at the end of the day, like people need to understand what their happy number is. Are you going to be okay with like $300,000 a year, $500,000 a year, $1 million a year? To like, what does it stop? Like, because if you have your house and car paid off, most people, most people that are, let's call it, have a good head on their shoulders, wouldn't actually be able to spend more than $120,000 a year if you take all your other expenses out, right? Like, because your mortgage and your car payment is like really the most the most heaviest piece on your on your income. And so, and even if you say you take, let's say, pay them off and still try to spend $200,000 a year, like I've actually done the math, and like you can actually have a very comfortable life living no matter where you are in this country.
I mean, I think about this a little bit less from a how much money do you need, those kinds of things, and a little bit more from a why are you doing these things? What's your risk tolerance?
Yep.
What's your end goal? I think for a lot of people who are sort of chasing $1 billion, the money is not the money is not about the money, right? It's not.
Money's a
I need
status
that
of
money.
Success. It's more
when I raised venture. When I raised venture, I was, young. I think I raised my first round of venture when I was 20. 29. And I did it mostly because I wanted to be taken seriously by other tech bros. Like, this is the, I don't mean to cast shade intentionally, but like I wanted
It's okay.
people in that world, right? I wanted people in Silicon Valley and San Francisco and, running these big tech companies. I wanted to think that I was cool and a big deal and important. And I wanted to be invited to the same events that they got invited to and on those stages and written about in those publications. And that motivation was really powerful for me. I was like, no, I belong with this crowd. I'm good enough. And to prove that I'm good enough, I need to raise this money. And that, and then I back end justified to the investors and to my team and everything else, right? I was like, okay, here's how we can deserve this money. Here's how we can use it to grow. Here's how we can become these things. And Moz was quite successful, right? For a long time. Like, it had a long, sort of 10-year run of 100% year over year growth and get to $50 million in revenue. And then it kind of, petered out a few years after I stepped down as CEO. And it turned into probably not even a 2x return for, at least for its later stage investors.
I would agree with you. I think for founders, the motivation is more likely related often to status than it is to the money per se. Because I think if you are educated and you want money, you probably become a corporate lawyer or go into investment banking. Becoming a founder doesn't seem like the smartest strategy for that. But what is a chance to do is have a huge impact, right? Like, founders can end up transforming how we live our lives at large, right? If you go become a cog at like a corporate law firm, then you have an impact just like any job has an impact, but you're not going to become someone who transforms society. And I think a lot of founders are drawn to that. And then once you are in that universe, I do think VC money, and also who is your VC, right? Like, there's these rankings of VCs and the status that comes with having a top tier VC versus one in the Midwest that nobody's heard of. And I do think it comes into play. And also on the flip side, VCs, are very much herd animals. They really, things become the hot thing and then everyone wants to invest on it. They hear someone else at a good firm is investing and then suddenly they're ready to make an offer, which again ties back to how good are these people at making these decisions.
By
how
association, I'm not
rational.
going to be able to raise money after this podcast.
I mean, I think there's plenty of good reasons to go raise venture capital. I've talked to folks who, for example, are in hardware or life sciences or clean energy.
Yep.
And yeah,
you need
you are not
infrastructure for that. Yeah.
You need the
infrastructure,
money.
right? So yeah, you're not like clean energy. You're not going to go and build a new solar tech firm or a new wind farm firm or a wave energy generation plant and prove your prototype and get that. Like, you're not going to do that with less than hundreds of millions of dollars. And private investors who use a SparkToro like model is not a match. But I would argue equally that venture capital, which is a great match for that clean energy tech, is a terrible model for sustainable, long, slow growth, not slow, but 20 to 50% year over year growth
Organic.
SaaS businesses that are relatively low cost and that can run profitably and probably will be more successful in the long term at both solving their market problem and returning money if they are given a lot of time to develop that, as opposed to, hey, how are you going to get 200% year over year growth? Because if you don't, you won't get the funding.
Yeah.
And if you don't get the funding, you've overhired and you've overspent and your cost structure is way out of whack. And so you won't survive.
Yeah. And again, I mean, if we stick with the hypothesis that, yes, this is an environment created for rapid experimentation, and the common guidance is every funding round should last you 18 to 24 months, and everybody who's on this journey understands that, you will get to an outcome, right? Like it won't be like, it may not be the outcome, but you will get to an outcome as long as everybody understands that. The issue is when people don't understand what they're getting into. And outside of understanding, they don't realize it, like internalize it, and make sure that their families are okay with it and stuff like that, right? If that happens, you are like going to be in a great place to go build this thing out, right? But very few times does that happen, because in most cases people actually don't fully understand what they're actually getting into, and then they're not playing with the same rules, and but the operators are playing with the same rules, and so you're just another person who went out and became part of the experiment, you know. So there was an experiment on, hey, the hypothesis that we want to prove, is that going to be true or false? And then you are also the experiment as a founder, saying, are you going to be able to last or not, so that you can go after to the next experiment? Because first time founders that go through an exit almost always get funded, right? Very few cases where they don't get funded the second time around. The second time founders get funded maybe 90-95% of the time. Third time founders guarantee you getting funded, because you already have a track record with the company, unless again you did something stupid, you know, then not.
You know where the stat doesn't hold up. This is going to be shocking to no one, but especially not shocking to Kelly. Women.
Yeah.
Second
Yeah.
time women founders get funded at a lower percentage than first time male founders, which is pretty disgusting. Like this field is not logical or rational or reasonable. It really is
Tilted.
A boys' club, and it is a networking thing. I will tell you that almost all of the introductions that I got to venture capitalists who seriously considered, you know, putting money into Moz, who I had like meetings with and went to their offices and all that kind of stuff, those all happened through a network of people who basically invited me out to dinners and drinks and parties at their houses in San Francisco. Almost everyone. A few in Boston, but mostly San Francisco. And that network was very hard to penetrate. And I think if I had been, you know, a late 20s something woman, holy shit,
probably.
I cannot even fathom what that experience would have been like. Like, hey, come around to our place tonight. Like, as me, right? As this guy, I can just do that and feel great about it. Like, I could be like, wow, that's so cool. This guy's inviting me over to his place. That's awesome. We're going to get some drinks, going to have some food, and like, okay. And then chat about business stuff. And he'll be like, hey, yeah, man, you know, I know someone at Sequoia. You should have a conversation with them.
And I'll text him right now.
It's interesting though, because I feel like in the wake of Me Too, there were some high profile examples of VCs who were like reprimanded or put on the outs. There was that book, which I feel terrible. I can't remember what it was called, but it was essentially, do you have it?
I have it. Yes. Wait a minute. It's on my shelf. I have too many books on my shelf. Okay, I'm going to...
That's a plus sign, but...
While Rand is doing that, I just want to announce that this is not a podcast funded by HubSpot, because Rand is actually the co-founder of inbound.org. And so we've already had like 7 people from HubSpot, and Kelly actually works at HubSpot. So just putting it out there, this is Kelly and my project to actually like figure out how to unlearn things, you know, so...
Thanks for looking out for me, Asher.
I mean, HubSpot is a fantastic example of a company, right, that was in that like top 5%, top 1%, even probably an even more elite top 0.5% group. Brian and Dharmesh, right, second time founders, maybe might have been Dharmesh's third company actually, and you know, they had a lot of relationships with all of the right kinds of people, and they had you know, sort of
they had David Stock from Matrix Partners helping them out. This was a very long-term friendship. Yeah,
they had like lots of all the right kinds of things going on, and obviously they were also very good builders and operators and managers, right? And hired good people and built a great team. Built actually what I think is one of the best cultures around in big tech companies. I've spent, you know, lots of my time in the HubSpot world and around HubSpot world, because Dharmesh and I formed an early friendship when he had just started the company. And, you know, he was one of the people who, he and his wife took Geraldine and I out to dinner right in Boston a bunch of times, and introduced me to people in his network, and was super supportive. Now he's an investor. He's one of the small private investors in SparkToro. And so, you know, I don't I am not, oh, I hate every venture-backed founder, or, oh, I think the asset class is like generally evil for everyone and totally wrong. I think it can be very appropriate for the right kinds of purposes. And it's wrong for all these other things that we try to shoehorn in there,
Yeah.
mostly because I don't know what it is. Like the testosterone pumps into your body and then tells you that you need to go, be a real man. And in the tech world definition of that, that is raise venture capital from, these places, as opposed to, I'm going to show my ignorance of, whatever gun culture. It's like, I need to own these weapons and like be able to shoot them at targets really far away
Gangs of
with
mass
accuracy.
destruction. That's a good term.
Yeah. It's just, right. It's just a, like, it's sort of this statusy,
Yeah. I mean,
insular
humans are
world.
animals, right? They have this nature to compete and to chase status. I mean, Plato said that thousands of years ago. He said something to the effect that, like, you can create little ribbons and people will kill themselves to compete over it just because it's status. It doesn't matter what it is. And I think that's true. And this culture, this subset of American culture, is very much infected by it. Do you so one angle, right, is to create models like you've created and then hope that those spread for the appropriate use cases. Do you ever other thoughts on like structural change, like how people can who see this as a problem? And to your point, not that the whole model needs to necessarily be dismantled, but how and whether it's a tax thing where there's a change there as one solution. It is okay. Is that a possible avenue?
I think I think that is the most direct, honest, and fair one. It's to recognize that the experiment over the last 50 years in American sort of late stage capitalism of trickle down economics was a failure. That is not what happens when you lower tax rates for millionaires and billionaires. You actually concentrate wealth rather than spreading it. When you have extremely low taxes and lots of tax loopholes for people with extraordinary wealth, you mostly concentrate wealth, you don't spread it.
Yep.
And so I would say that tax policy is the most important and best place where you can do that. I mean, I read yesterday, 75% of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, who agree on nothing, are supportive of equalizing tax rates and of a $20 minimum wage. I think if you change those things, right, and you start to spread wealth, wonderful, wonderful things can happen sort of macroeconomically. Like I believe it is a fundamental good to have economic distribution of wealth rather than concentration in the sort of horrific pyramid system that we're in now. I would also argue that if you want to change the problematic ways in which venture biases their capital allocation, which I would argue, I think humanity generally agrees, and it is well proven, that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not.
Yes.
There are absolutely hundreds, if not thousands, of founders and companies built by Black people in the United States, indigenous folks, folks who come from backgrounds that are completely underrepresented or unrepresented entirely in tech and in venture backing, who would do a better job, who would make them more money, right? And so they are working against their own interests by biasing towards this small subset of people who are, whatever, going out to dinner together in San Francisco. And to change that, there's two ways that changes. One is like sort of slowly through culture and awareness, and the Me Too movement and a lot of this, the awareness that's been brought to the venture field had its chance. Like
yeah,
I think
that's
venture
what I was
had
gonna
its,
say. I don't feel like it had much of an impact. Like
no,
I'm seeing
it
new
had.
stats coming out. They're not changing the game.
You are exactly right, Kelly. Like they are the opposite of changing the game. The funding stats for women, for people of color, are worse. For veterans. They are worse than they were 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And so all of this talk, right, from all these VCs who sit on stages and are like, well, we're trying to really expand our portfolio. We're looking into D&I. We're looking into equity and inclusiveness. We're trying to find more diverse backgrounded founders. All lies, 100% lies. Either that or they're so terrible at it that they don't deserve their job, right?
They're like, I
So,
looked at my party that I threw with my network and I didn't find anyone.
and I don't think they're evil people who like get together in cabals and are like, okay, we only fund white and Asian dudes. Got it? Everybody agree? Like that. I don't think that's what happens. That's not it. What happens is their network looks like them, their network is like them, and inside their network, they're like, well, they're gosh, this Rand Fishkin guy, he's got a really compelling product. I know he's another white dude, but I can't resist. We got to back him. Like he really fits the model, and they convince themselves, right? So
Pattern.
I would say, yeah, they call it pattern matching, which is essentially just bias, racism, sexism, isms of all kinds. You
Which
call it whatever you
the
want.
more you're guessing, right? Which in early stage startups, no matter how good you are, there's a big guessing element, right? The more those pattern recognition comes into play, and I think that's why.
Generally speaking, Americans hate this concept, but it works, and that is some form of affirmative action, right? Where you essentially say, "Oh, are you starting a venture fund with more than $50 million in capital? Guess what, friend? You are going to deploy 20% of that capital to founders with, backgrounds that are underrepresented." And lots of weird things will happen as a result. There'll be founders who are like, ugh, I guess I'm going to like technically get a co-founder who fits one of these, criteria so that I can fund my company. And guess what? Even those things which are like, oh, that's not what we wanted. Like what it will do? It will bring more of those people into those boardrooms. It will build those people's networks. And then those people's kids and friends and brothers and sisters and families will also have access to those networks that they never had access to before. Yeah. And over time, it does make a difference. So, I know this is not a politically popular thing. I know it's not something people don't like, the idea that they are getting chosen because of who they are, not what they are or what they've accomplished or those kinds of things. I get that. I totally get it. And I also don't think there's a more effective way to get true change of this variety, right, of the type that we need, than to force the situation from above.
What about
and
some
put
kind
your
of
hand
a
on the scale
blind
for a while.
I think, and that can break the pattern, right? That's the goal with that method, is that you start to break the pattern, because to your point, then people are in the boardrooms, they're seeing people different. It starts to disconnect. Oh, 28-year-old white male, founder, CEO in the back of the brain. But what I would love to see is a VC firm who does a blind submissions, like has the presentation. You can distort the voice where you can't tell the gender, you don't know the race. And see what the outcomes are, because they have done studies in a bunch of different disciplines where they've had musicians perform behind like a curtain, and they saw that the outcomes were different when before. Same thing, right? People had something in their mind. So I would love to see one VC firm do that, and now of course you don't get immediate return, so it would take years probably to get outcomes. But
my only criticism of that methodology, Kelly, is it's been used particularly in computer science, right? So like computer science schools and hiring and that kind of stuff, and shows exactly what you would want, right? That like, no, women candidates are not worse candidates for whatever computer science degrees or jobs in computer science roles or those kinds of things. But culturally, there is such a bias against women going into computer science that the numbers are vanishingly small enough that even if you blind hire and blind pitch, you won't get enough. Like you don't.
So you're saying you would have to
numbers.
ensure that there's enough submissions from those groups into the blind funnel.
You'd have to incentivize you have to incentivize white dude founders to be like, all right, shit, I really need people who are not like me to be on my founding team. That's you have to create that idea and then seed it and then push it, and there's going to be 25 years of awkwardness and shittiness, and then things start to, I'm serious, like that's just how I'll give you a good example of this.
I hate to like take a segue, because these sessions always end in me apologizing for for not actually getting the topic that I really wanted to talk about.
I'm sorry. I thought this was our topic. I didn't
This
know.
isn't topic. No, I'm just kidding, because like we always should talk for 55 minutes, and they were like, we could talk for hours. And I again, like every one of the guests that we've had, and we've been blessed and fortunate to be able to like have these amazing conversations. No, this was totally the topic, because we always start with what's top of mind. But I know we have like 11 minutes left, but I also, and we'll for sure have you back, like, you know, like, but the thing that I believe you have expertise in is audience building ish, right? And so one of the, let's say, like scenarios we're going to throw out at you, right, that you can kind of help us think too, and by virtue of that, maybe hundreds of thousands of people like unlearn these bad habits, right? Is like, let's say Kelly and I have a goal that we want to make the Unlearn podcast the number one podcast in the world, right? And so from all the experience and all the less, because I'm saying this
I'm
because
just
there's like,
I'm laughing because that's not my goal. I would not want to have that many listeners, but
let's say
but
I
continue.
want to make the
Continue.
number
This is
one
a good
podcast. I want
topic.
to be selfish. I want to have the number one podcast. I also want to be.
It's true. Asher would be selfish, so
Exactly.
that was what would
It's all
happen.
good. You know? It's all good, right? So like what's happening in the world of like connecting with your audiences and stuff like tell us like what's the real deal right now?
Yeah. So let's obviously lots of things are changing in the sort of world of digital marketing and audience building, and we can talk about that in terms of the podcasts specifically. So podcasts became extreme, massive growth during the pandemic.
Yeah.
They have dipped somewhat, but they're nowhere near below their pre 2020 days. So podcasting, I think, is still a great way to build an audience and reach an audience. What I would say is, if you want to be the number one podcast, which I agree with Kelly, not a great goal. I say that because, right, the number one podcasts are things like the Joe Rogan Experience, right? So my recommendation to you would be like, go become famous in another sphere, and then come like maintain or return to podcasting as part of that fame, and then interview and podcast with generally famous people on topics that are sort of interesting to everyone, as opposed to guests like me who talk about this very specific industry thing, right? So like, when you are thinking about audience growth and audience building, my advice would be that raw popularity shouldn't be your goal. You should instead say, among this audience of people, which is who I really want to reach and who I really want to resonate with, I want to be the number one podcast for them.
Yep.
That might be a defined category inside of iTunes or Libsyn or whatever, and it might not be. It might be something that you self-define, and you say, hey, the people that we want to reach are whatever, founders of early stage companies, or we really want to reach people who are in digital marketing and late stage of their career, VPs and CMOs, whatever it is, right? Like I would carefully choose that audience. HubSpot did a great job of carefully choosing exactly who their audience was at each stage of their growth, and then building content and a network and an audience attracting flywheel around each of those groups. Moz did the same thing. In my case, much less intentionally than Dharmesh and Brian did it, right? Because they'd sort of been around their merry-go-round before. I think the biggest thing that's changing around all this is, historically, if you wanted to build an audience, one of the best ways that you could do it was to create content, podcasts, videos, whatever it was, like create your sort of home on the web, and then bring people to that home on the web through all the other channels, right? So rank highly in Google search results, send tweets that link back to your content and your site and promote your podcast on there, and do that on LinkedIn, and do that on YouTube, and do that on Reddit, and do that on TikTok, and blah, 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 Instagram, all these places, right? And bring people all back to your home on the web. And this is philosophically still something that I agree with very much, but you can't count on these networks to help you do it anymore. All of these networks, from Google to Facebook to YouTube to LinkedIn to Reddit, they all bias against content that takes people outside their experience, right? So
yeah, it's interesting. Like they they say LinkedIn that you're supposed to put the link to whatever you're talking about in the comments, which I never do that because it's a terrible user experience. And I don't care that it's going to get me more impressions because I'm like, I don't want to dig among 80 comments to find somebody's link. So I'm not going to do that to other people, but I do know that they'll punish it with impressions. So I totally agree that that's something you have to think about intentionally, right? How you're going to play it.
My colleague Amanda Natividad, who's like, I think she's one of the great marketers of our generation. She coined this phrase, zero-click content, right? Essentially creating things that build brand awareness and ambient awareness of, a problem space or a concept or a thought pattern. They build interest in you and your brand. They build interest in your podcast, but they do not drive traffic directly through a clickable link on these platforms. TikTok and Instagram, for example, there's no opportunity. You can't have a clickable link. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there. Even if you put the link in bio, right, you're not going to be able to track which thing sent the, what video that I put on Instagram got people to click on my link in bio. I don't know. And link in bio stuff tends to do way worse than stuff that doesn't mention it. And LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, all of these places, no links does better. Google search, which is still the biggest traffic driver by an order of magnitude on the web, has been moving the last 4 or 5 years. I've written about this and published some research about zero-click searches, that essentially what people expect and want from Google now is I search for a thing and Google gives me the answer that they have extracted from the web so that I don't have to click on anybody else's website.
Yeah, and those snippets where that you can often get that answer, and now with AI, right, it's just going to be even more so the answer's right there, and you only need to go on if you're trying to do some deep dive on a niche subject or something that's much more detailed. So it is interesting. It's a lot harder, right?
Yeah, I think it's just a philosophically different mindset. You're essentially optimizing for impressions, not clicks and traffic. And that is a huge change from the last 20 years of marketing. And we sort of have to unlearn all the things that we've learned about marketing over the last 2 decades, right? And get into this new world of, in a lot of ways, treating internet marketing, digital marketing, social media, content marketing, SEO, email marketing, all this stuff, treating it like the way billboards and radio and television ads were treated in the 20th century. Which is, I don't know that billboard brought that person into my auto repair shop. But I know that when we had more billboards along that highway, we got more business.
Traffic, yeah. All right. Unfortunately, we're at time. But just to hook in our guests, because I'm going to hook in people, I'm going to produce the video where Kelly was like, I want this podcast to be the #1 podcast, and I'll post it on LinkedIn. I'm just kidding. There's no video for that. Yeah. So, Rand, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We'll invite you over again to talk about other things, but this was great. I mean, you really made this amazing for us, and we hope that we made this amazing for you, and we look forward to having you again.
Right back at you. Asher, Kelly, thank you so much for having me, and you folks take care of yourself. Good luck on becoming the #1 podcast in the world. I look forward to that.
Thank you for listening to Unlearn. Subscribe wherever you listen and visit unlearnpodcast.com for the transcripts.